episode of the 1980-1981 Monday evening lecture series. I'd like to welcome the faculty and staff of the College of Architecture and Planning, the members of the Ball State community, and any members of the Muncie community that we have with us this evening. We are honored this evening to have with us Mrs. Clare Cooper Marcus. And by way of an introduction, I'd like to say that she is currently an associate professor at the University of California at Berkeley in the Department of Landscape Architecture and in the Department of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, where she teaches courses in environmental psychology. Mrs. Marcus has had a variety of experiences in Great Britain, Sweden, Puerto Rico, and the United States as an educator, a lecturer, a professional consultant, and an author. She has written a number of articles on the social aspects of housing and open space design, which have appeared in publications such as the American Institute of Architects Journal, Landscape Architecture, Landscape, Design and Environment, the Journal of Housing, and the Journal of Architectural Research. She has, to her credit, written and published 2 books, the first of which was published in 1975 and is entitled Easter Hill Village, Some Social Implications for Design, and the second, Housing as If People Mattered, Design Guidelines for Low-Rise, High-Density Family Housing. This is scheduled to appear on the bookshelves this year. Much of her work in these 2 publications has been to find out residents' feelings about their environments and then to compare those findings with the original objectives and assumptions of designers. The outcome of her research has been compiled to offer recommendations for future design projects. Tonight, in a similar vein, she is here to talk about post-occupancy evaluation, which offers significant insights into our roles as environmental designers. I'd like to say that there will be an opportunity after her presentation for anyone to present any questions that they may have. And with that, I'd like to welcome her to Ball State University and Muncie and introduce you to Mrs. Clare Cooper Marcus.
Working? Can you hear me at the back upstairs? Yes? Oh, good. Okay, thank you for your introduction, Scott. And you said I'm going to be speaking tonight on post-occupancy evaluation, which is a subject close to my heart and something that I've been doing since I arrived in this country as a graduate student in the early 60s in Berkeley, where I started doing housing evaluation research. And more recently, teaching in the landscape department, I have been teaching students how to do this kind of research themselves. And so a lot of the slides I'll show you tonight are from student work at Berkeley. I have a philosophy of teaching that people learn best by doing and by experiencing rather than reading about. And so a lot of the work done in my classes consists of going out into the environment and looking at housing and parks and playgrounds and plazas and evaluating how the design works for people. So I've been told that the tradition is this must be an hour and no longer, or I will get docked so many dollars per minute or something it goes over. So I will make my introduction as brief as possible and talk mostly with slides, but I do want to start with some general remarks about post-occupancy evaluation. And even before those, I want to say that my firm belief is that the purpose of design and planning is not only the creation of physical artifacts or the preservation of delicate ecosystems, if you happen to be a landscape architect, but also as settings, or primarily as settings for human behavior. And that I feel that that we must recognize that it's the people using spaces, inhabiting them, working in them, visiting them, who the users or consumers of spaces who are the ultimate arbiters of their success or otherwise. I take issue with the whole ethic of the design professions, which says that success is when you get a prize from the AIA Journal or the ASLA. I don't happen to like the way in which prizes are given, usually on the basis of photographs of projects, often given to projects that are never built. And so if I had my way, prizes would be given or awards would be given when a project has been in existence for several years and has had a post-occupancy study done of it, so that it not only fulfills the professionals' views of good design, but it also fulfills the needs of the users who are saying, yes, this is a good place to live, or this is a creative park design. But I think we're a little way off seeing that happening. So post-occupancy evaluation consists of going back to a designed place and finding out if it's working the way the designer intended, and if indeed the designer had the right goals in the first place. We should be doing this, first of all, to better understand how the environment affects people's feelings and behavior and how they affect it. Only by going back and looking and asking and observing can we begin to build up a vocabulary, really, of what the environment is doing for people, what they're doing to it. We should be doing this also so that we may more accurately predict in a future environment how it might work, and also to avoid costly mistakes. We can do post-occupancy evaluation on a number of bases. I mean, one could say that an aesthetic evaluation or a design award evaluation is a form of evaluation. There are also people who go around doing post-occupancy cost evaluations and post-occupancy mechanical efficiency evaluations of buildings. Right now in Berkeley, because, and I'm sure in this state, because there is now a law making it required that every state building be accessible to the handicapped, there's a whole lot of evaluation of buildings in terms of accessibility. But what I'm interested in talking about is evaluation in terms of the quality of experience for those using, residing in, working in a designed environment. So what we're measuring in a post-occupancy evaluation, I will now call it a POE, what we're measuring is performance criteria, or how well does this environment perform for those who use it. Now, a few words on why. I've mentioned a few reasons for why this is important, and one of them I said was to avoid costly mistakes and to avoid the effort of constantly reinventing the wheel every time we start on a new design. It's also very wasteful of federal and tax money, your and my tax money. To give you one example, in 1976, the federal government spent an estimated $150 million to aid local and state governments in the purchase, development, and operation of city parks. There is absolutely no systematic evaluation procedure for deciding how well that money was spent, whether in fact the parks designed were in keeping with what people wanted. HUD, Department of Housing, through housing loans and mortgage insurance, affects the residential experience of millions of US citizens, and yet there is no systematic procedure for evaluating buildings that are built with HUD money. Certain legal measures, such as the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA, began to make it more necessary for us to start looking at environments and how they affect people, because people were having to produce environmental impact statements. The designers were having to state what the social consequences of their design might be. And I mean, ironically, there is very little basis on which to make such statements. I hope that I can convince you this evening that it's just irresponsible of us as professions to move on blindly from one project to the next without finding out if our assumptions were correct, if the form of physical translation was correct, or if there were any unintended social consequences of what we did. To suggest a medical analogy, it's as if a doctor diagnosed a problem, prescribed a cure, and then never bothered to find out if the patient died. I believe that we can no longer act as if we were solely artists, unaccountable to society for our actions. Now, what are some of the current attitudes towards this sort of research? In 1972, Albert Fine produced a very lengthy study of the landscape architecture profession, sponsored by ASLA, and one of the major recommendations in that study was the promotion of more POE research to assist both practitioners and educators. In 1974, a task force was appointed on POE by ASLA, who recommended that POE research methods should be taught in all schools of landscape architecture. At present, I believe it's taught in relatively few. It recommended that ASLA should work towards the inclusion of POE as an integral part of the design process. We are lucky in the landscape profession that in the editor of landscape architecture, Grady Clay, we have a person who's a strong supporter of evaluative research, and if you should happen to do some for a thesis or a student project, you will have a supporter in Grady Clay in terms of publishing such work. In the architecture profession, there are really only two journals which are similarly committed to the publication of objective, user-oriented evaluations of buildings. Those are the AIA Journal in the US, which in the last few years has had an editorial policy of encouraging evaluation of buildings, and the AJ, or the Architects Journal in Britain. The rest of the Architects Journals still stick, like PA and others, to basic arguments about form, style, and theory, and construction details squeezed in between ads for floor tiles and lighting fixtures. Not to say all those sort of articles are not also important. I'm not trying to say they're not. But it's too bad that some of the prestigious architectural journals very, very rarely, if ever, publish an article which talks about how this building works for people. In 1976, HUD contracted with a research firm to look at the state of the art of POE in housing. And I want to quote a few things from that report. They found, for instance, that there were a number of countries way ahead of the US in recognizing the need and value of this kind of research. Probably the most advanced is Sweden, which has a comprehensive system of evaluating its housing and then feeding this information back into the agency that makes guidelines for housing. New prototypes of housing are built. That is evaluated as a constant cyclic process in which hopefully design is getting better in terms of satisfying people's needs. In Britain, Norway, and Denmark, there has also been long involvement in the field at a government level. The HUD report recommended that this country, at least through HUD, government-sponsored housing, start to do such evaluative research, but so far it's still in the discussion phase. It looks as if Canada is probably going to, there's a lot of serious discussion in Canada about making this kind of research mandatory. So if there are good arguments for this kind of research, and we can see that it might cumulatively produce better ways of predicting design results, why isn't it being done? A number of reasons. One is the lack of involvement. The main one is the lack of involvement of the designer after the construction phase of a building. That once the designer has designed the building and it's constructed, in terms of his or her contract, they move on to the next job. And so they have a very good reason, financial reason, not to do an evaluation study of that building. There's a lack of any legal mandate to do POE. There's usually no money slotted into the budget. There is also some bureaucratic resistance to doing it. There's also some disbelief among bureaucrats and designers about the usefulness of design, the usefulness of research. In fact, there was one study that found something quite disturbing, which was that they surveyed a number of a lot of architects, practicing architects, and something like 96% of them agreed that the environment, yes, indeed, influences people's behavior. And about 87% said they were aware there was research about the effects of the environment on behavior, and only 20% ever looked at or used this research. So there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance there between understanding that it's important and yet not being willing to either do it or to use other people's work. Who should be doing this kind of research? I firmly believe there should be multidisciplinary teams of designers and social scientists. I hope I can show you with the student work, I'm going to show you that this kind of research is not mysterious or difficult, that social scientists, like most professions, try to mystify what they do in order to give themselves some status. It's not very mysterious or very difficult. I'm a completely self-taught sociologist, if indeed that's what I do. My training is in geography, not in sociology, and I learned it all out of books or by trial and error. And you too can do the same. So it's not something you have to hire a high-priced consultant to do. I think designers should be in on the team of an evaluation so that they can talk about what it was they had in mind in the beginning. At Berkeley, I mentioned that I teach students how to do this kind of work, and I try always to make sure the work is useful to some outside agency. And so each year when a class I teach that has about 100 students in it doing this kind of work, I approach the local parks department or housing agency and say, is there some place you would like to have looked at? Because here was all this student labor who've got to do it anyway to learn how to do it, and we'd like to produce something useful to you. So over the years we've done evaluations of virtually all the parks in Berkeley for the Berkeley Parks Department. We've done evaluations of all the beaches in Golden Gate National. That was a great assignment that year when I told the students they were going to go and evaluate beaches for near our national park in the Bay Area called Golden Gate National Recreation Area. We've recently done a major study at the campus because the campus plan was being revised, and no one had thought that it might be interesting to find out what the outdoor spaces were used for. As typical of planners, they were looking at the buildings and what was inside them, and the outdoor spaces were considered sort of leftover voids in between. So we went this year and did a major study of the campus. What should... Well, I firmly believe we're now at a point, at least in housing research, where there is a sort of a beginning to be a critical mass of case studies of housing and how it's worked for people, that we're at the point when we can start looking at that research and wording it back to designers in the form of guidelines and recommendations. So I will end my lecture today by showing you some examples of what I mean by housing guidelines. And as Scott mentioned, I've just completed a book, which is in fact the whole manual collection of housing guidelines based a little bit on my case studies and mostly on many, many other case studies by other people. Finally, before I get to the slide, I feel for those of you who are soon going to be going out to work that this method of looking at environment is going to be crucial in the future, because with budgetary limitations and things, my hunch is that more and more of you will be doing work which comprises the redesign of existing spaces rather than the design of new buildings, parks, etc. from scratch. We can no longer afford to buy land for new parks and many cities. So what we're going to be doing is taking 19th century parks and redesigning them for today's use. There is a lot of money available, not much money available for housing, but what there is available for the rehabilitation of public housing from the 40s and the 50s. And this is a technique that allows you to go into an existing place and say, well, let's see what's going on here. How is it being used or abused or misused? How is the design serving people or not? So let us start with the slides now and see if this little thing is working.
Introduce you to Mrs. Clare Cooper Marcus.
Okay. This is a diagram out of a book by John Zeisel, who teaches this kind of subject, or did at Harvard. Here is his diagram of how the design cycle or design process ought to be, starting off with pre-design programming or the analysis phase. We move into a series of alternate designs, and then you choose one design, and then it's constructed, and then usually at this point in the process, post-occupancy evaluation, which is a subject close to my heart and something that I've been doing since I arrived in this country as a graduate student in the early 60s in Berkeley, where I started doing housing evaluation research, and more recently teaching in the landscape department. I have been teaching students how to do this kind of research themselves, and so a lot of the slides I'll show you tonight are from student work at Berkeley. I have a philosophy of teaching that people learn best by doing and by experiencing rather than reading about, and so a lot of the work done in my classes consists of going out into the environment and looking at housing and parks and playgrounds and plazas and evaluating how the design works for people. So I've been told that the tradition is this must be an hour and no longer, or I will get docked so many dollars per minute or something it goes over. So I will make my introduction as brief as possible and talk mostly with slides, but I do want to start with some general remarks about post-occupancy evaluation. And even before those, I want to say that my firm belief is that the purpose of design and planning is not only the creation of physical artifacts or the preservation of delicate ecosystems, if you happen to be a landscape architect, but also as settings, or primarily as settings for human behavior. And that I feel that we must recognize that it's the people using spaces, inhabiting them, working in them, visiting them, who the users or consumers of spaces who are the ultimate arbiters of their success or otherwise. I take issue with the whole ethic of the design professions, which says that success is when you get a prize from the AIA Journal or the ASLA. I don't happen to like the way in which prizes are given, usually on the basis of photographs of projects, often given to projects that are never built. And so if I had my way, prizes would be given or awards would be given when a project has been in existence for several years and has had a post-occupancy study done of it, so that it not only fulfills the professionals' views of good design, but it also fulfills the needs of the users who are saying, yes, this is a good place to live, or this is a creative park design. But I think we're a little way off seeing that happening. So post-occupancy evaluation consists of going back to a designed place and finding out if it's working the way the designer intended, and if indeed the designer had the right goals in the first place. We should be doing this, first of all, to better understand how the environment affects people's feelings and behavior and how they affect it. Only by going back and looking and asking and observing can we begin to build up a vocabulary, really, of what the environment is doing for people, what they're doing to it. We should be doing this also so that we may more accurately predict in a future environment how it might work, and also to avoid costly mistakes. We can do post-occupancy evaluation on a number of bases. I mean, one could say that an aesthetic evaluation or a design award evaluation is a form of evaluation. There are also people who go around doing post-occupancy cost evaluations and post-occupancy mechanical efficiency evaluations of buildings. Right now in Berkeley, and I'm sure in this state, because there is now a law making it required that every state building be accessible to the handicapped, there's a whole lot of evaluation of buildings in terms of accessibility. But what I'm interested in talking about is evaluation in terms of the quality of experience for those residing in, working in a designed environment. So what we're measuring in a post-occupancy evaluation, I will now call it a POE, what we're measuring is performance criteria, or how well does this environment perform for those who use it. Now, a few words on why. I've mentioned a few reasons for why this is important, and one of them I said was to avoid costly mistakes and to avoid the effort of constantly reinventing the wheel every time we start on a new design. It's also very wasteful of federal and tax money, your and my tax money. To give you one example, in 1976, the federal government spent an estimated $150 million to aid local and state governments in the purchase, development, and operation of city parks. There is absolutely no systematic evaluation procedure for deciding how well that money was spent, whether in fact the parks designed were in keeping with what people wanted. HUD, the Department of Housing, through housing loans and mortgage insurance, affects the residential experience of millions of US citizens, and yet there is no systematic procedure for evaluating buildings that are built with HUD money. Certain legal measures, such as the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA, began to make it more necessary for us to start looking at environments and how they affect people, because people were having to produce environmental impact statements. The designers were having to state what the social consequences of their design might be. And I mean, ironically, there is very little basis on which to make such statements. I hope that I can convince you this evening that it's just irresponsible of us as professions to move on blindly from one project to the next without finding out if our assumptions were correct, if the form of physical translation was correct, or if there were any unintended social consequences of what we did. To suggest a medical analogy, it's as if a doctor diagnosed a problem, prescribed a cure, and then never bothered to find out if the patient died. I believe that we can no longer act as if we were solely artists, unaccountable to society for our actions. Now, what are some of the current attitudes towards this sort of research? In 1972, Albert Fine produced a very lengthy study of the landscape architecture profession, sponsored by ASLA, and one of the major recommendations in that study was the promotion of more POE research to assist both practitioners and educators. In 1974, a task force was appointed on POE by ASLA, who recommended that POE research methods should be taught in all schools of landscape architecture. At present, I believe it's taught in relatively few. It recommended that ASLA should work towards the inclusion of POE as an integral part of the design process. We are lucky in the landscape profession that in the editor of landscape architecture, Grady Clay, we have a person who's a strong supporter of evaluative research, and if you should happen to do some for a thesis or a student project, you will have a supporter in Grady Clay in terms of publishing such work. In the architectural profession, there are really only two journals which are similarly committed to the publication of objective, user-oriented evaluations of buildings. Those are the AIA Journal in the US, which in the last few years has had an editorial policy of encouraging evaluation of buildings, and the AJ, or the Architects Journal in Britain. The rest of the Architects Journals still stick, like PA and others, to basic arguments about form, style, and theory, and construction details squeezed in between ads for floor tiles and lighting fixtures. Not to say all those sort of articles are not also important. I'm not trying to say they're not. But it's too bad that some of the prestigious architectural journals very, very rarely, if ever, publish an article which talks about how this building works for people. In 1976, HUD contracted with a research firm to look at the state of the art of POE in housing. And I want to quote a few things from that report. They found, for instance, that there were a number of countries way ahead of the US in recognizing the need and value of this kind of research. Probably the most advanced is Sweden, which has a comprehensive system of evaluating its housing and then feeding this information back into the agency that makes guidelines for housing. New prototypes of housing are built. That is evaluated, and it's a constant cyclic process in which hopefully design is getting better in terms of satisfying people's needs. In Britain, Norway, and Denmark, there has also been long involvement in the field at a government level. The HUD report recommended that this country, at least through HUD, government-sponsored housing, start to do such evaluative research. But so far, it's still in the discussion phase. It looks as if Canada is probably going to, there's a lot of serious discussion in Canada about making this kind of research mandatory. So if there if there are good arguments for this kind of research, and we can see that it might cumulatively produce better ways of predicting design results, why isn't it being done? A number of reasons. One is the lack of involvement. The main one is the lack of involvement of the designer after the construction phase of a building. That once the designer has designed the building and it's constructed, in terms of his or her contract, they move on to the next job. And so they have a very good reason, financial reason, not to do an evaluation study of that building. There's a lack of any legal mandate to do POE. There's usually no money slotted into the budget. There is also some bureaucratic resistance to doing it. There's also some disbelief among bureaucrats and designers about the usefulness of design, the usefulness of research. In fact, there was one study that found something quite disturbing, which was that they surveyed a number of architectural, a lot of architects, practicing architects, and something like 96% of them agreed that the environment, yes, indeed, influences people's behavior. And about 87% said yes, they were aware there was research about the effects of the environment on behavior, and only 20% ever looked at or used this research. So there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance there between understanding that it's important and yet not being willing to either do it or to use other people's work. Who should be doing this kind of research? I firmly believe it should be multidisciplinary teams of designers and social scientists. I hope I can show you with the student work, I'm going to show you that this kind of research is not mysterious or difficult, that social scientists, like most professions, try to mystify what they do in order to give themselves some status. It's not very mysterious or very difficult. I'm a completely self-taught sociologist, if indeed that's what I do. My training is in geography, not in sociology, and I learned it all out of books or by trial and error. And you too can do the same. So it's not something you have to hire a high-priced consultant to do. I think designers should be in on the team of an evaluation so that they can talk about what it was they had in mind in the beginning. At Berkeley, I mentioned that I teach students how to do this kind of work, and I try always to make sure the work is useful to some outside agency. And so each year when a class I teach that has about 100 students in it doing this kind of work, I approach the local parks department or housing agency and say, is there some place you would like to have looked at? Because here was all this student labor who got to do it anyway to learn how to do it, and we'd like to produce something useful to you. So over the years we've done evaluations of virtually all the parks in Berkeley for the Berkeley Parks Department. We've done evaluations of all the beaches in Golden Gate National. That was a great assignment that year when I told the students they were going to go and evaluate beaches for near our national park in the Bay Area called Golden Gate National Recreation Area. We've recently done a major study of the campus because the campus plan was being revised, and no one had thought that it might be interesting to find out what the outdoor spaces were used for. As typical of planners, they were looking at the buildings and what was inside them, and the outdoor spaces were considered sort of leftover voids in between. So we went this year and did a major study of the campus. Well, I firmly believe we're now at a point, at least in housing research, where there is a sort of a beginning to be a critical mass of case studies of housing and how it's worked for people, that we're at the point when we can start looking at that research and wording it back to designers in the form of guidelines and recommendations. So I will end my lecture today by showing you some examples of what I mean by housing guidelines. And as Scott mentioned, I'm just completing a book, which is in fact a whole manual collection of housing guidelines based a little bit on my case studies and mostly on many, many other case studies by other
that
people.
kind of ambiguity in a part works in this
Finally, before I get to the slides, I feel for those of you who soon will be going out to work, that this method of looking at environments is going to be crucial in the future, because with budgetary limitations and things, my hunch is that more and more of you will be doing work which comprises the redesign of existing spaces rather than the design of new buildings, parks, etc. from scratch. We can no longer afford to buy land for new parks in many cities. So what we're going to be doing is taking 19th century parks and redesigning them for today's use. There is a lot of money available, not much money available for housing, but what there is available for the rehabilitation of public housing from the 40s and the 50s. And this is a technique that allows you to go into an existing place and say, well, let's see what's going on here. How is it being used or abused or misused? And how is the design serving people or not? So let us start with the slides now and see if this little thing is working. Okay. This is a diagram out of a book by John Zeisel, who teaches this kind of subject, or did, at Harvard. Here is his diagram of how the design cycle or design process ought to be. Starting off with pre-design programming, or the analysis phase. We move into a series of alternate designs, and then you choose one design, and then it's constructed, and then usually at this point in the process is where you fade out, and you legally you go on to the next job. Maybe you check back once or twice that the building is not leaking. But John and I and many of us in this field would argue that this and this phase are equally important steps of the design process. People move in, they start to use and modify and adapt the environment. And along here, John calls it post-diagnostic evaluation. I think that's a nice term. I use post-occupancy evaluation myself. Here comes the testing out of whether the needs you suggested here and the translation of needs that you promoted here are in fact correct, whether the translation process was right, whether the goals that you enunciated in the beginning were correct. And when you've done that evaluation, that information should feed on into the pre-design programming of job number 2, saying that that's assuming it's the same kind of building. You did one housing project, you evaluate it, you're doing the second housing project, and it also should feed into general design knowledge, into teaching in schools of design.
So that's what I mean by a method of maintenance or management about how a place is.
All right, because I gather that there isn't no specific course here in environment and behavior studies, I'm just going to start with just a few examples of books in the field for those of you who might want to start reading. This was one of the first books in the field by a psychologist at UC Davis. Personal Space. It's available in paperback and it's very readable. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. The Hidden Dimension by an anthropologist at Northwestern, who's some very interesting cross-cultural studies of how space is used. And this, one of the first textbooks in this field, in environmental psychology, written by the faculty at probably the best school of environmental psychology in the country, which is City University of New York. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is primarily case studies of actual environments and how they work. And I mentioned that some European countries have a much longer tradition of this work than this country does. The models that I've used principally have been from Britain, from the Department of the Environment and the Ministry of Housing, who have a whole sociological research section who does nothing but evaluate buildings that they have built. This is one of a few such case studies in the U.S. This is published by the Urban Land Institute in Washington. Now, just to emphasize that this kind of evaluation study does not have to be a very huge, elaborate, or indeed very expensive or time-consuming study. This is a study done by 5 graduate students and their teacher at Illinois, Urbana-Champaign Department of Landscape Architecture, of a major plaza in Chicago, which some of you may know. And they did this whole study in about 3 weeks of observing and interviewing, etc. And it's probably the most detailed study of a plaza ever done in this country. It was done in 3 weeks for a matter of a few $100s. And it's a very nice publication. I hope you have it in your library or will get one. So this doesn't, and this was a real contribution to knowledge. Until then, now there is a very nice book about plazas by William White, but until that was published, this was probably the only detailed evaluation of a city plaza, despite the fact we're producing them and they're costing enormous amounts of money. We just haven't spent time to go and see how they work out. So first of all, just a few slides of some of the steps that one might go through, and I've used here a neighborhood park as an example, that you might start off by casual observation, or I'd call this the hanging out phase. Before you ever start doing anything in an environment as well as in the way of research, I recommend that you just go and hang out there and take a picnic to the park or have your lunch in the plaza and just get a feel for what's happening. Then if the designer is available, you might want to go to the site with the designer and try and record what were some of the things he or she decided to do, and then record some of the changes that have been made. If possible, go on a walkthrough on the site with the management and maintenance staff. Indeed, in park studies, my students have often found that it is the gardener in the park or the maintenance man who is the most informed person about how a park works. He's there every day. He has to pick up the litter. He has to admonish the children who are vandalizing the trees. He knows exactly what's happening. And then you might, step 4, I think I would forget about. Step 5, you start looking at behavior traces. I say forget about 4 because we're going to look at users in other ways, which is probably better. You start looking at traces in the environment as to how it's used or misused, like shortcuts and worn play equipment, and I'll show you a lot of slides of those. And then, this seems to have a tremendous time lag on it. Is this buzzing a buzzer up there? Or, okay. Then we go on to behavior mapping, which is actually recording on a map, and I'll show you some slides of that, exactly where people are in the park or the open space at different time slots during the day. So you get a picture almost like stop frames in a movie of who is doing what where on the site. Finally, then you get into questionnaire development and interviewing people, because behavior mapping and behavior tracing will tell you something accurately about what people do, but cannot tell you about what's going on in their head. It cannot tell you about what they feel about what they do, or how often they come, or how far they come. And those are things that you have to get through interviews. So, finally, analysis of the data, writing of the report, and then use of it, maybe to program another part to add to a data bank of knowledge, as a case study in teaching, etc. So let us, all right, this was a little diagram that I put together for an ASLA conference last year when I was talking on the subject matter. So it's kind of plugging that ASLA should take a role in this. Here it is in the middle of the clearinghouse. I can't remember where this diagram starts now. I love architects who do this kind of flow chart. I thought I'd try one, but now I don't remember where it starts. I think POE research on completed project. Okay, it starts at the top there. So theoretically then, we might have people doing these kind of case studies, let's say of parks or housing projects, feeding this into some kind of data bank at ASLA, who periodically would produce from it sets of guidelines disseminated to landscape architect profession, clients, parks commissioners, etc. These would then be used by practicing landscape architects in design, by clients in selecting between alternate designs in teaching, studio clips, etc. Hopefully the designer and or client would then record the decisions they've made on their next design, the assumptions they've made, which would then be there sort of on file, ready to be tested in the next round of POE research. And then somewhere over here you have someone looking at the techniques and methods and feeding this back into this section. This is sort of essentially what's happening in a more complex way in Sweden, where housing is being evaluated and the information is fed back through various agencies, so the next round of housing is hopefully included. Now, when I send students out doing this kind of work, I always preface it by a lecture, and I can't do the whole lecture tonight, so I'll give just a few slides, a lecture on design as communication. And my message to them is that design is out there, and whether the designer thought about it or not, it is a potent form of communication in concrete, in trees, in grass, and pathways. It is saying, implicitly or explicitly, to the users, walk here, sit here, do anything you like on this lawn, sit facing this way, etc. There are implicit communications. And some communications are clear, and some are ambiguous. And sometimes ambiguity is okay because it allows you freedom. And sometimes ambiguity is definitely not okay because it leads to confusion. And I'll show you examples of both. So one of the things I had them look at is ambiguity or clarity in this communication through design. Here's what I term as an example of clear and, to me, quite aesthetically pleasing design. It is quite clear that that is a seat and that there's an option which way you face. There's no ambiguity about what that's for. Similarly here, there's no ambiguity, though it isn't particularly aesthetically pleasing. It is a picnic, place to picnic in a park. There's an implied message which says, we think you're going to mess up. So there's concrete under the table to be hosed down. There is an implied message also that says, we don't think that privacy matters to you. We don't think that wind screening matters to you, etc. It's just sitting out there in the middle of the prairie in this park. It's not particularly attractive, but it's also not ambiguous. It's clear what that's for. The next slides, I think, illustrate some examples of what I mean by ambiguity. This is a housing project in Rockford, Illinois, in which the housing encloses a court, which is probably labeled on the site plan parking. And it is indeed parking, but the children also read it as a place to play. And the other places to play aren't as attractive. So here is a sort of ambiguous situation, which the ambiguity here might lead to actual injury. Here in some recently built housing in Berkeley, the ambiguity is in terms of private space or communal space, a very common error in low-rise, high-density housing. Here is someone's private living room. Here is a patio only half fenced. There is no privacy. As a result, the patios have ended up being storage places for bicycles, barbecues, garbage cans, and the people in the project, because the public pathways are so close and the children are playing all over, constantly keep their living rooms curtained, which incidentally has implications for energy use. It means you probably have the lights on all day when you don't really need them, because you have to keep those up. If they had thought in advance and included this patio fence all the way around, this wouldn't have happened. So that's an example of ambiguity. Here's another micro detail of ambiguity. I think it's obvious what the ambiguity is here. Here's someone's, actually it's their bedroom, and here's a public another piece of ambiguity. This is in an elderly housing project. In other senses, very sensitively designed, but who on the drawing board was thinking when they put these benches facing into a blank wall? If the bench had no back, it wouldn't be so bad because you could choose which way to sit. The way that where I'm standing taking the picture is a beautiful landscape courtyard. And, I think some of these kind of detailed design errors happen at the working drawing stage when someone is just doing something absolutely mechanically. They are just not thinking about what's going on, and no one picks it up until it's too late. Here's a little example of ambiguity. Here's the doorway of this kid's house, here is the playground, and here's a fence, and here's a fence. There was no attempt to join the fences. Well, obviously, all of us go the shortest distance between A and B, especially children. And so this piece of landscaping never grew and got all muddy and dirty. And probably the landscape architect walks through that project and says, wretched kids messing up my planting. Well, it's not wretched kids. That's just not recognizing how people move around. If you don't want them to go by the direct route to the swings, don't leave a gap in the fence. Now, the first thing I have students do then when they go out and do an evaluation is I don't have them go talk to the designer, because that would be absolutely too much. There's 100 students, and my name would be mud if they were all ringing up all the designers in the Bay Area. So I say, go to the park or the project and try and analyze what you think the designer had in mind. What does the design tell you? How does it communicate? And divide it into what you see as the functional areas that this designer might have intended. This is a small park in Berkeley, and as you see, a lot of the area, all this, which was indeed a kind of open green meadow, which was intentionally ambiguous, so that all kinds of things could happen. It actually functions very much like a village green, a very successful park. Now, that kind of ambiguity in a park works in this kind of setting, which is primarily Berkeley student use. And people go to this park and they jog and they play frisbee and they meditate and they do Tai Chi and they eat yogurt and they run their dogs, and heaven knows they do everything. And it accommodates everything. And so there the ambiguity is perfect. In a suburban neighborhood family district, maybe such ambiguity would not be so appropriate. Maybe more structured areas of the park would be appropriate. Here is another student's analysis of the same park. So it doesn't mean to say that two people going to the same design space are going to see the same messages. This student found all much more detailed. The first student had called all of this tennis playing. This one found there were actually little subspaces, places where people waited, places where people hung around the water fountain, all kinds of different details. So this is the first stage in the process. Not very nice graphics, but this just illustrates, in housing particularly, I get students to say, all right, look at the site plan and figure out what was intended as public space, as semi-public, semi-private, and private, because unless you have distinctions among those, you're going to start getting problems, especially in high-density housing. Now, if we think of design as suggesting, as communicating to the users what might or might not happen in a space, there is another set of people communicating, and that is the management. Don't think that your design, once it's put up there, is going to work necessarily just the way you intended, because along will come a manager or a maintenance staff and put up fences where you didn't expect, put up notices saying keep off the grass where you didn't think they were going to. So I asked the students also to analyze the messages from the management on the site, whether they be verbal messages like these, or sometimes a maintenance message. And here, unless one heard the story of this, you wouldn't know what it was. This is a campus at the University of Queensland in Australia. And here is the sentence. Whoops, no, I didn't press it on. No, go back, please. Go back. Unless you, okay, this is the campus in the center of the university, and it's an obvious place for people to go, like your quad. It's the place where you expect people to go on a sunny day to eat their sandwiches. And when does the maintenance staff turn on the irrigation? Exactly at noon every day, to keep the students off the grass for lower maintenance costs. Now, if you think that's awful, I'll tell you there's a good many housing authorities that do exactly the same thing. They turn on the irrigation when the children come home from school in order to keep them off the grass, because if kids are kept off the grass, it doesn't last long. So that's what I mean by a message from the maintenance or the management about how a place is used. Now, to move on, I mentioned that after you've looked at how messages from the designer, messages from the management, then you start looking at communications back from the users to the designer and management. And the first set of messages that I asked you were what I call behavior traces. A behavior trace is evidence in the landscape that someone has done something. Even if those three little girls were not in this picture, one could see that someone had been making a sandcastle on them. Obviously, these kinds of messages show up next week better in landscape than in buildings, because the landscape wears. Now, here's a suburban park, San Jose.
One doesn't have to be too much of a detective to figure out that kids have been bicycling across and over this hump. People wouldn't necessarily want to walk across it, but get around it. Now, I show this slide to my students and I say, all right, if you get a message like that in a design that you're evaluating, there's a number of ways you can react to it. You can look at it and say, wretched kids riding through the landscaping, who do they think they are? I'm going to put a fence around that hump so they can't do it. Okay, and then the ivy will grow and it will all look aesthetic again. Or you could say, as a designer, gee, I didn't think about kids. I remember I would like to go bumping over humps when I was a kid. Next part you might say, let's leave it the way it is. It really doesn't matter that this bare earth is not there. And the designer, if they were very enlightened, might say, the next part I design, I will deliberately put in some humps and bumps on a bicycle track so children can do this thing which they want to do without messing up the landscape. All right, here is a shortcut, a behavior trace, which tells you something about the numbers of people cutting across here. Obviously, a large number, this is a very wide shortcut. And here's a clue that, in fact, this isn't just an eyesore in the landscape, but potentially a very dangerous situation. Older kids bicycle through this playground, the shortest route between somewhere in the library or something, I can't remember where. An obvious situation that calls for some regret. Now, behavior traces are not just things like shortcuts or vandalism. They're also where people place things in the environment. The fact that these people have put their washing out here in this little embayment off the corridor suggests that they have claimed that space as their own. It says something about their feelings of territory. Notice the washing does not project out into the corridor. It also says something about how they perceive their neighbors. It says, we feel this is a safe enough environment for us to put our washing in a semi-public place and it won't be stolen. If you look around, particularly in housing, you'll begin to see all kinds of clues about people's need to personalize and whether or not the environment and the management encourage that to happen. This is very successful elderly housing in London. The things that have been added just in this little picture are sort of the wrought ironwork on the doorway and the curtain inside and the gnome and the coach lamps and the bicyclist up here and the green porch and flowers. And the next slide shows what you see when you step back from the steps. Not just those things. Now, obviously, this person not only had a great need to garden and display their flower-growing flowers, but they felt that it was okay to do this. So it says something about how they feel the environment permits this to happen. All the way down this subject were flowers. Now, behavior traces can also tell you something about people's mood in the image. They can tell you about people's expressions of anger, when actually they're so angry about something in the environment, they're going to smash it up. This was the reaction to the traffic preservers in Berkeley when they first went up. People were so angry at not being able to drive as fast as possible from A to B, that they actually came out and might smash up barriers. Here in Sweden, a sign in a housing project saying ball playing forbidden, which has been shot up with a BB gun. Now, maybe it was just a convenient target, but maybe that's a clue about the children's anger that they were told not to play ball in that particular place. Behavior traces can also tell you about people's fears. This is a housing project in San Francisco that indeed has a very high crime rate. And there are bars on all the windows and barbed wire along the tops of the patio fences, which tells you something about how they perceive the social environment that they live in. Behavior traces can also tell you something about territoriality and pride of ownership. This is a housing project in London. Since Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, the public housing is systematically being sold. Rental public housing is being sold for as long as they can afford it. And there's a very smart team of researchers who are monitoring this project and seeing what happens to the physical environment when a person changes from renter to owner. And the fascinating thing they're finding, not surprising, I guess, is the very first act a person does upon owning a piece of property they formerly rented is to redefine the boundaries, whether it's by painting the wall white, in this case, ripping out the hedges that the housing authority gave them and putting in their own fences, repainting the gate or whatever. A sort of symbolic gesture to say we now own this place. Behavior traces can tell you a lot about how little clues in the environment allow people to put their mark on it, to lay claim to it. This is in that same elderly housing project where all the flowers were. This is just a little tiny corner. The public pathway goes up the steps to the right. And this is just a little piece of design. I don't know if the designers deliberately put it there as a place that people could occupy, but this person quite rightly said, well, this is just off the public domain. I think I'll take this over. There's a lot you can tell about how environment helps you to personalize. Behavior traces can also tell you about the non-use of the environment. Bicycle racks in a shopping center in Britain that are filled up with dirt and never used, because apparently people don't want a bicycle in that space. A tot lot outside a laundry in a Swedish new town. It doesn't, again, take much detective work to see that a sandbox full of weeds is not one that's often used. If children were playing in it, the weeds wouldn't get a chance to grow. So just from that evidence alone, without any interviews or anything fancy, you might say, well, maybe this laudable idea of sandboxes outside of laundry is not such a great idea. People don't take their kids to the laundry, or they bring the washing machine there, whatever. Behavior traces may tell you something about what's lacking in the environment. There's a housing project in Atlanta where people hand wash because they didn't have washing machines, they couldn't afford to go to the laundry, and there were no washing lines, so the little fences around the project and then that shortcut were used all over the place for hanging out the washing machines. So with this phase of post-construction evaluation, one year did a real, he called it a Sherlock Holmes approach on this part, and he went through the garbage cans analyzing the litter and found that by looking at the litter alone, you could deduce there were two basic groups of users. The junior high junk food crowd, who left Taco Bell wrappers and hamburger weekly paper, and the Berkeley hip health food crowd, who left yogurt cartons and melon rinds. That was indeed the two groups of users of this place. So you can start to look at these behavior traces: bicycle tire marks, climbing pins on the rock, cigarettes and candy wrappers in a place with a beautiful view over the bay, football scrimmage marks. All of those things can begin to tell you something about how that place is used. Here in a housing project, for example, I don't get them just to map it, but to start to say, what might that mean? What can you deduce from that? Now, obviously, behavior traces are not the only things we look at. We also look at actual behavior. This is that same meadow-type task again. So we have to start looking at what people are actually doing. And I'll show you some of the ways that you can do that. Well, one way might be if you were looking at a whole neighborhood, you might do what's called a driving census. This is one in a low-income neighborhood of Baltimore, in which just by driving around and recording people, they quickly deduced that most people were paying in the streets and alleys, which are the figures on the right, and very few in the parks and playgrounds, which are dropped in the left-hand column. If you were looking at circulation patterns, this is a worksheet from that Chicago Plaza study, you might want to trace people's movements through a space. That would be called tracking behavior. What I get students to do is what we call behavior mapping, and I ask them to go on at least 4 occasions to the project or the park they're looking at different times of the day and different times of the week, and on each visit to record where everybody is. Now you notice that the dots here each have a number attached to them. In an adjacent notebook, the next slide shows, whoops. You go back one? Okay, well I guess I lost that slide. In an adjacent notebook, it would say 1 black male, 6 years old, playing on the swing. 2 white female, 14, talking to a friend. It would start to list all the attributes of each one of those people. So you could eventually start to analyze that space in terms of how it was used differently by boys and girls, adults and children, different times of the day. And I'll show you some of those. Right, let's pass by that one. Next. All right, then you can start to, when you've got that kind of data, you can start to document it in graphs. This is a plaza on the Berkeley campus, which shows not only that the peak use, oh no, that isn't by age, okay, so peak use is student age people, predominantly male. Next. The same plaza studies where students started to look at the circulation patterns. Next. Same housing project I showed earlier, you can start then to look at, break it down in terms of happens to be children by sex, and illustrate something which is true very predominantly if you look at housing projects or any kind of housing, that boys will almost inevitably have a wider territorial range than the girls. They're allowed more freedom in the environment. So you see the girls on this plot are all clustered around the playground, and pretty much nowhere else. The boys are all over the site. Here in another housing project in San Francisco, this similarly is looking at the difference between boys and girls play. All this area is dominated by boys. Girls play in smaller enclosed areas in the entrances, and there was just one place on the site where boys and girls play equally. This was predominantly boys playing basketball who were older and noisier and dominated the site. Same site analyzed in terms of adult and child use. Children dominating the interior of the site, adults only being seen at the entrances, and again one seating area where there was a mix of adult and child use. Now all this kind of analysis tells you more and more in detail about how the site is actually used. Another way of dealing with that behavior data, that you might want to plot it against time. This was some work that I did in the housing project in San Francisco, showing something which turns up in virtually every housing study, notably that when you looked at through the day, throughout most of the day, children will predominate in the use of common open space in housing, and adults will be a relatively, except for here, I don't know why that peaked 11, I don't know what that was, it's not going to work, but anyway, there's a great disparity between the use of such space by adults and children. You could start to look at the data in terms of the surfaces that people are on. This is a very large study in London of children in housing projects, and so it showed that despite the fact there was ample grass and playgrounds in these housing projects, the predominant use of the outdoors was paved pathways. Again, this is something I found in housing studies I've done. However nicely you design the playground, however nice the lawns are, the predominant play will take place on the pathways, because children like to bicycle, to roller skate, to skip, to run, and all of those things take place better on pathways than on grass. And most studies will show that playgrounds are rarely used more than 1/4 of the time that children spend outdoors. It might be significant for you to look at this behavior data by race. In this case it was the housing project in San Francisco, where in fact Asian inhabitants predominate in terms of the families who live here, but you wouldn't know that from the outdoors, where in fact the black children predominate and intimidate the Asian children who are kept inside, causing considerable problems. Now, looking at behavior traces and behavior will tell you a lot about how the place is used, but it won't tell you anything about, as I mentioned earlier, what people feel about the place. So if you really want to round out the picture, you must combine observations with interviews. This is a very successful plaza in Sydney, Australia. These are just some examples of questions and answers from that Chicago study. There's a whole lot of charts in that study of what people like and dislike of the plaza, what they would like more of, less of, etc. Now that kind of information you can only get from questions of people. This is a student study at Berkeley a few years ago. The student was interested in what the people in this complex remembered about the site plan, what was significant to them. And he asked a sample of people to draw the site plan of the place. And this is what the composite map looked like. In fact, the lake in the middle and the landscaping, which had been a large part of the budget, was very predominant in people's memory. And outside of that, they sort of all disappeared out to the edges. They didn't really have any feeling or memory of the site plan beyond that practical space. A very good thing to use in interviews, I found, is photographs. If you want people to compare their housing with other housing, show them a photo of a whole series of housing and ask them to put them in sequence. So never use more than 4. That seems to be the limit to which people can put things in sequence. In this case, this was, no, any of us. I mean, you start getting 5 and 6 and you don't know quite what to do with the middle one. This is a series of photos I used in my study at Eastern Hill. This was people's first choice, suburban housing. Just go to these pictures. Next. Second choice, where they looked at this, which is very much liked by Berkeley students and faculty as sort of Victorian California housing. The housing project residents looked at this and said, boy, that's kind of old-fashioned housing. Wouldn't want to live there, except that if the houses aren't joined together, we wouldn't hear everything next door as we do with the housing project. And this last picture was their last choice, which again would be a prime place to live in San Francisco. And they looked at it and said, oh, that's Frisco, which is a way of putting down San Francisco. These are the people I was interviewing were in Richmond, which is across the bay, who don't like San Francisco. And they looked at this picture and they said, boy, I wouldn't want to live there. If my kids live there, they get into trouble. There'd be no good people and drug dealers and pimps and whores and God, and they named every urban ill you can possibly think. Absolutely untrue. That's a really quite nice neighborhood. And this just gives you some indication where people have images about neighborhoods that maybe have nothing to do with reality. Another thing that you can only do by questioning people in such an evaluation study is to find out if certain objectives of the designer came off or not. In this case, this is Eastern Hill Village, a place I've written about, and the designer had a very laudable objective of trying to make every dwelling look slightly different in a very, very low budget job. So what they did is they tried to paint every facade a different color. It's very washed out by this point. Some of the porch railings were horizontal, some were vertical. The next slide shows some other differences. The buildings were staggered, some were wood and stucco, some were all stucco, some of the porch things were flat, some of the windows were clumped together, etc. There was something like 20-something different ways in which they tried to vary the facade. When I went to interview people, I asked, first of all, if this was a good objective, and I said something like, would you like your house to look different from the one next door? And everyone said yes, it did. It's nice to go out and dress and see someone else's dress, same for our house. Then I said, do you see differences here? And more than half said no, there were no differences between the houses. And those that did see differences saw only 2 things of those 20 odd things the designer had done. Those were color and height, which psychologists tell us are the 2 basic things you see in differences of objects in experiments. Color differences and shape differences. Virtually no one saw this and this, or this and this, or windows, or chimneys, or materials. However, when I took a class of architecture students out there and asked them the same question long before the study was published, they saw this and this and all these things because that's what you're trained to see. So my conclusion for all this was that all of that facade gimmickry was a real waste of effort and budget in this particular situation where the lack of money had meant that there was an incredible sound transfer between units. And that was a gross infringement on people's privacy. And if the designer had really thought about what is more important, he would have realized that privacy comes before aesthetics. And he should have spent money on creating a better sound walls and on all these design differences that people didn't see anyway. It also just brings up the obvious fact that designers and non-designers see the world differently. Now, when you're thinking about questioning the users of an environment, remember that children are users too, and children are quite capable of answering simple questionnaires or interviews and have rather strong feelings about things like parks and playgrounds. It's a very nice study. One of my students did a few years ago, and taking these kids around to 4 Berkeley parks, and in each one letting them play there for half an hour and then fill out a questionnaire about what they felt about it. The end of this process then of looking behavior tracing, behavior mapping, interviews would then start to analyze how does this place work or not work for the users. In this case, we found the problem in this part was that part of it was essentially a neighborhood part, top part, and part of it was a sort of urban plaza on a busy intersection, and that the differences between the two, which you then did in the redesign, next, should be emphasized, and the neighborhood part should allow more play and bicycles, etc., and the urban part should be made even more urban. So this is the last but one phase, and this is a set of slides with another student's work, a nice little waterside park on the bay with a fishing pier and picnicking. Next shows his analysis into functional areas, and I don't have all the slides, but his observation and mapping, but his conclusions next. Well, this was his redesign. He found in interviewing and observing that the fishing pier was heavily used, and they could use another one. He found that people came with their kids, and while Dad fished, there was nothing much for the kids to do, so he added a playground. He found that picnic tables were overused and added some more, etc. They're not very major changes, but they can subtly make it better for people. Sometimes the reason for the need for redesign is not anything to do with the designer making a mistake, it's just a question of age. Here is Union Square designed in a classic Beaux-Arts style of 100 years ago, which doesn't really fit in with today's needs, although no one would really want to redesign it. Those little lawn areas, which you saw in the last slide, are surrounded by low, dense boxwood hedges, because in the Victorian time, no one would have dreamed to go sit on the grass. They would have paraded on the pathway, and the grass was to look at. Well, things are different now. There's a great lack of open space in San Francisco, and people break through the hedges in order to sit on the grass. So the students who are evaluating this part just proposed that those breakthroughs should be more formalized and made cleaned up really quickly. Here is one of a number of mini park evaluations we did for the Berkeley Parks Department that resulted in the redesigning this park. This was a very small mini park, one house lot inside. And they had put the basketball court at the entrance with some good reason. They said, well, the kids want to see each other playing basketball, and they'll be able to see from the sidewalk. They put the tot lot back here, away from the traffic. And both of those sound like reasonable decisions. However, the design completely backfired. This became dominated by teenage boys who were so noisy and loud and just active in their play that they completely intimidated mothers and small children running the Broadfoot past them. So nobody came back here. There were a lot of these clusters here. These were teenagers playing, smoking dope and dealing in drugs. This was in a fairly low-income neighborhood, which was a perfect place because it was quite out of sight of the street and the police. So that the young kids in the neighborhood for whom this was really designed didn't get to use it. So the Berkeley Parks Department, in redesigning it, cut off the street and said, there's no way we can make this safe. And they sold that piece back to someone up here. And then they took out basketball and put it in a park down the street because they figured teenagers could walk another block or two, and turned this into the potluck. And now it works beautifully. The parents come by and use it, and the older kids don't play here at all because they argue they are more mobile. So now the last slides are just running through some of the kinds of things this kind of research can tell us and the implications for design. This is just some work from a British project. There should be a time scale, and it should go from something like 0 to 10 minutes. This just gives you some indication of how children have a very short attention span when playing, and they spend 30 seconds on the swings and wander around, and 10 seconds on the merry-go-round, and sit back in the merry-go-round. Now, all of that should tell you that when you're designing for small children, you should be designing for the maximum amount of variety and not doing something like this, which looks moderately pleasing, at least the rocks are pleasing. And here is this funny bit of tubular steel sculpture, and there's about 2 things you can do on it. And those will probably take you 30 seconds, and then you're bored, and you're off somewhere else. So if you are designing for children, although you may not find this aesthetically very pleasing, it was designed by the children and the play leader and not by a designer, called Clare Park in London. Children would come to this playground and stay the whole day because there were so many things to do, swinging, sliding, and playing tag over the top layers and balancing on these beams down here, and just all kinds of things to do. Post-construction evaluation can also suggest ways in which we should be redesigning the environment. This is a very rundown and unhappy housing project in London, where surveys found that, in fact, one of the problems was that here was semi-public space, and here was private space, and there was no buffer in between. So one of the first things they did in redesigning this project was to give everyone a garden, which was simply done and fairly cheaply done. Immediately gave people in here more privacy, gave these people a place to put plants and a dog and let the toddler run, and kept the public space away from the house. A simple thing which should have been done in the first place, but it wasn't done in public housing in the 40s and 50s. There's been a lot of redesign going on for greater sense of security. This is a piece out of Oscar Newman's book, Defensible Space, a housing project in the Bronx that had a fairly high crime rate, especially in these common areas. So they redesigned this site, and they gave everybody a front yard, which did this definition again of private and public. They put good lighting in the public spaces. They added a playground. And what happened was that people started coming out, taking care of their gardens, casually surveying this space, and the crime rate went down quite considerably. Here, so post-construction evaluation can also be used by agencies to evaluate, should be doing, for evaluating what it's doing. This is some housing in Scotland, where the housing agency very wisely hired a research team from the University of Edinburgh to evaluate this housing. They found this was a completely new kind of housing in Scotland. They found that people loved their houses, which were these L-shaped figures. They loved their private open space, which were really enclosed atriums. It was a very windy, bleak site. That's very pleasant. The big problem on the site were these lighter green areas, which were the supposedly common open spaces of the project, which looked from this design as if they were the spaces left over after someone had played around with the T-square. And indeed, I think that's what they were. Now, what happened was that kids coming home from school looked in here and said, a park, because they'd never seen common open space before in a housing project, and they quite rightly came in and started playing soccer in there after school, at which case all of these people got very upset because they were playing for the upkeep system. And there was, as a result of this evaluation, when the housing authority built their next housing, they made sure that the units surrounded, or nearly surrounded, the common open space, so there would be no ambiguity about it being a public park. Here's some post-construction evaluation done on two neighborhoods in British Newtown, where they wanted to see which one they should continue, which prototype they should continue using. This was segregated. This is vehicle access, and in the interior of the block there was a nice series of connected open spaces and pathways. They found when they compared that site plan to this, an earlier form where there was really just streets, houses, and garages at the back, no common open space, that the child accident and actual death rate from accidents was twice as high on this neighborhood as on the first one. It seems like a very good one. Post-occupancy evaluation has sometimes been used as a means of actually changing quite radically housing policy. This is part of a whole lot of both empirical evidence and circumstantial evidence used in Britain to decide against building high-rise housing in families, which the government banned in 1958. It became clear after many surveys that people with small children are the most penalized by living in high-rise buildings, and so on down until we get to the elderly who perhaps will be penalized, in fact, sometimes avoid such children. So this is essentially what the policy is now, of putting children with families with young children no higher than the third floor, families with older children who can manipulate the elevator here, and maybe the elderly and people without children on the upper floor. Another Newtown study in which the planners had put the pathways on this neighborhood scheme in the interiors of the blocks running around the backs of those houses, and around the neighborhood had put what they called a distributor road, and said, well, people won't walk here because they're going to be walking in the middle of the block where the cars will be. Well, people don't often do what it says on the site plan. And people continued to walk on these roads, and no sidewalks were visualized, so there was constant, well, potential conflict between cars and people. In later designs, they decided that people are probably going to walk anywhere, so you better put sidewalks everywhere on the sidewalk. This is just an example. It's not exactly a post-occupancy evaluation, but I just wanted to throw these slides in. This is almost instant personal tragedy post-occupancy evaluation. This is the story of how how the design innovation has started to happen in the Netherlands and has now spread into a lot of countries in Western Europe. In 1975, there was a journalist in Delft whose child was killed in an accident outside his house. And when he had somewhat recovered from the shock of this event, he realized how very angry he was at what had happened before. And he began to contact other parents of similarly bereaved parents who had lost their children. And they set up an organization, and they published this very provocative and influential brochure which says, "Stop the Child Murders." And what it did was plead for a restriction on traffic in inner city streets. And what has been happening now in Holland is the idea got taken up by the Royal Dutch Touring Club, who put out this very nice colored booklet in English. And these lunas are streets in which the car is allowed to come, but only at the expense of driving very, very slowly. The whole street is taken apart, the whole street is paved so that it looks like it's a pedestrian street, but although cars are still allowed in. So it's like handing the street back to the pedestrians. I haven't been to Holland to see them yet, so I can only show you 2 slides from Britain where this idea simultaneously arose. As far as I can see, in the 2 countries, there was no connection at the time. The British didn't know about this brochure in Holland. So here it's the suburban housing for sale in the north of England. You drive up here, and you might, by looking at this, talk about design messages, look at this and say, well, this is for pedestrians. Obviously, it's paving stones, it's rocks, it's grass. But look, here is the garage, there is the garage, one over here, one over here. And here is the same courtyard viewed from the opposite direction. You'll see that the cars, in fact, drive up over the pavement, turn sharp right very slowly and go into their garage. Same here. So here is a kind of design that has emerged from, in Holland, a tragedy, and in other places just continual sort of evaluation of how the mixing of cars and people doesn't seem to work, and yet we've got to have cars and people want to drive up to the front of their house. And here is what I think is an extremely creative solution. They're called mixer courts in Britain, where the car is allowed to drive right up to the house, but under certain very strict conditions of speed. And all the messages suggest that this space is really for pedestrians and children. Another thing. Finally, a word about, I talked about observing and interviewing. Ideally, I believe, you can't really do an evaluation of a housing scheme unless you live there. This is one where after doing observing and interviewing for some years, I ended up living here, back up here on this square here, and had one child. Another was born there. So I had the experience of living there as a parent and taking care of their children. And I would say that the experience of living there added immeasurably to my understanding of this place as an environment. There were areas that I understood, levels at which I understood it, that I could never have got from interviews, however good the interviews were. The next slide just shows one example. Here, all this analysis of the site in terms of unambiguous and ambiguous spaces, these being ambiguous spaces where there is a form of street alignment. This was the kind of thing which I would never have dreamed of asking a question about. I hadn't even begun to think about that when I did the survey. But as a resident, I began to see things about ambiguity and unambiguity that had real implications for how the site can be used. Now, it isn't always possible to move into a housing project or study, but if you can, or if you live in one already, I would highly recommend that you take that one to study. Finally, we're at the point I mentioned earlier where we have enough post-occupancy evaluation of certain environments that we can begin to reword the information as guidelines or patterns. Many of you may know Chris Alexander's work in pattern language. This happens to be a pattern language for children's centers that was published many years ago, actually. And these are some illustrations from the book that I'm just finishing, Housing as If People Mattered. They're also written in Chinese because I recently went on a trip to China, gave lectures there, and so I had a student translate these. I believe, now my students actually don't like these illustrations. They were done by an architect. I like them because I absolutely didn't want typical architectural sketches where the people have no faces and they have triangular bodies. You know, those kind of architectural people. I think that subtly says something about how the designer thinks about people. I really do. That they're kind of nameless, faceless things blowing through the site. I wanted real people with faces, pigtails, and smiles, and all of that, even though it doesn't look highly professional. The book is going to be highly illustrated because I feel that's the only way to communicate this kind of research to designers. So it'll be illustrated. The last one was a sketch of that guideline about play spaces within view of the house. It might be accompanied by a picture such as this, which is a good example of this guideline in reality. And the next one, it might also be accompanied by a picture like this that says, look, there are ways in which you can give people privacy in their patio, and yet by lowering the fence at the gateway, allow a view out to the playground, which is very important. This is just a set of guidelines that the students in another class at Berkeley did for the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, determining access to the sides of the bay. Work by another colleague of mine at Berkeley who's become rather specialist in design for the handicapped. And there are now numbers of books with guidelines on that aspect of design. I think we're going to see in the near future many, many books like this dealing with design of particular places in terms of feeding back post-occupancy evaluation research. The final point I want to make is that here on the left is the kind of evaluation research I've been talking about. Here's the designer, here's the social scientist, here's the research, and the users are feeding this information via the social scientist back to the designer. This is not the only way to go. I'm not suggesting it's one very important way. Another important way, of course, is direct participation between the designer and the potential users. It's not always possible to find out who the users are going to be. And even if you were doing direct participation, there still would be a role for guidelines, which might then be handed to the users. And you might say, well, here's some guidelines we found out about how this kind of housing works. What do you think? Do these apply to you? And you might get that user group to weight those guidelines in terms of the ones that were important to them, the ones that were not so important. So this kind of participation in design is certainly something that is happening more and more. It's happening, has to happen in some legal situations. It should be happening. And that does not invalidate the need as well as this kind of direct participation that we still should be going back and looking at spaces after the fact and seeing how they worked out. So I think this is the last slide. So this is just to sum up what I'm trying to be saying today, that here is how traditionally housing design happens, that you do one and it works or doesn't work, but you don't really know, and you go on and do prototype number 2. And here is what should be happening. First post-occupancy evaluation includes design, setting for the second, and so on, hopefully resulting in increasingly satisfactory design and improving the process. Okay, it's very late, and so I think we should finish there. I'd be glad to answer questions either in the group or if you want to come up afterwards. Thank you.